Free will, predestination, Calvinism. I've been thinking about these things as long as I can remember, since I was a kid. I heard conversations about them. I'd ask what they meant. And I remember feeling deeply, deeply frustrated at the lack of answers to the questions I would ask. Oh man. A lot of people I would talk to came from a Calvinist sort of reformed background, right? And they felt they were defending God's sovereignty and the doctrine of grace, right? They felt they were defending the fact that human beings don't contribute anything to our salvation. That was very important, right? And therefore, we just sort of have to swallow this very tough idea about predestination. God just predestines certain people to heaven and other people somewhere else. And that's just how it is. That's what we have to swallow. But I was just frustrated with the lack of, the very obvious kind of questions you ask. Wait, does that mean that God doesn't love certain people? Does that mean that people aren't really responsible ultimately for where they end up in, hell or heaven, or maybe even for any of the actions they do? Is God responsible for evil? Just very straightforward questions, and finding the answers just deeply unsatisfying. Oh, well, in a certain sense, God allows evil, but he doesn't cause it. Really? Does he exhaustively determine every single event that happens? Isn't that what sovereignty means in sort of the very strict deterministic Calvinist view? Well, yeah, but and then you keep asking these questions and you just arrive at these appeals to mystery. Well, we just don't know. It's just a mystery, but that's how it is. And it's just this very deeply inappropriate way to leverage mystery. Every time you arrive at these contradictions, God exhaustively causes everything, but he's not responsible for everything. And it's just a mystery how that is. Oh, God can draw straight with crooked lines. He can kind of cause all things without being responsible for all things. How does that make any sense? Well, it's just a mystery. There are square circles. It's just a mystery. Mystery just gets used to paper over contradictions. Deeply inappropriate ways to use mystery. But on the other side, I would talk to Arminian leaning people, like free will leaning people. They're less interested in the sovereignty, the predestination type stuff, more interested in the free will side of things. I found equally unsatisfying answers, right? Oh, well, why does evil exist? Because, people freely chose to sin. The devil freely chose to sin. That's just how it is. Why do certain people end up in hell? Well, they reject God freely. That's how it is. God values our free choice. He respects our free choice. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Simple question. Did God know that the devil was going to sin before he created him? Did God know the devil was going to wreak all the havoc and all the evil we've seen in the entire earth everywhere? Well, yeah, I guess he did. Okay, why did God create the devil then? Why create him if you knew this is all going to happen? Well, I don't know. It's just a mystery. What about the people who end up in hell? The damned, right? Did God know they were going to end up in hell ahead of time before they were born? Well, I guess so. He knows everything. Okay, really? Then why did he create them? Why not just not create those people? Seems kind of horribly cruel if you know someone is going to end up in eternal torment and you make them anyway, right? Just equally unsatisfying answers on the other side. It just left me feeling, this whole conversation just left me feeling deeply frustrated. To be fair, the sort of reformed Calvinist people tended to have more answers, but I found those answers, what I just kept bumping into is there's this sense, especially on the Calvinist side, that we're defending grace, we're defending the doctrines of salvation, and it's so important. You have to swallow all this horrible stuff we're saying, because if you don't, you're somehow making man the ultimate. Man is saving himself somehow. Right? That just always struck me as wrong. Okay, so I'm going to tell you today. One last point. And the most frustrating answer I heard, and probably the most common to this question of how do free will, predestination work together was, it's just both. Oh, it's just both. They both are somehow true. They work together. God is sovereign and man has free will, and they work together. Great. How? How is it both? Explain that one to me. That was just so frustrating because that's a non-answer. Just saying it's both doesn't explain how it's both. You can't just say that. You have to actually explain it. Anyway, I grew up feeling deeply frustrated, and the more I thought about these things, the more I, read the Bible and learned answers, I started to work towards a solution. And I'm going to say something crazy. I have found an answer. I found an answer to these questions, which I find satisfying. I find it answers all the questions I had. How is it that God is sovereign and people have free will and they are truly responsible and God knows the future? All these questions. I think there are satisfying solutions, or at least I found one, to all those questions, and I feel a deep sense of peace after years of having wrestled with it and having thought about it. I'm not going to get into that today. I'm going to do a video series explaining my views and where I've come to. I've written all this out in an article that I published on my Substack. I'll link it below. It kind of goes into my thoughts in more detail. But for today, I want to make a very simple point. Calvinists, your view does not defend grace at all. It has nothing to do with grace or the idea that salvation is not by works, any of that. So many Calvinists, they think that you need to say that God exhaustively determines everything that's going to happen and that that's what sovereignty means. And the reason that is so important is because if you deny that, you're somehow making man responsible for his own salvation, and that's the gospel of works. All right, I want to present to you two views. Two views, they don't exist. No one actually holds these views, but I think they are hypothetical views which expose what I'm saying. One is compatibilist Pelagianism. So let me explain that. Compatibilism and determinism, they're kind of the same thing in my opinion, but determinism means that God exhaustively determines all things. Everything that's happened, every single event that has ever occurred in history, God determined that it would be so. Compatibilism says the same thing. God determined every single thing, and it also says it's compatible. That's compatible with free will. Free will can also exist while God is determining all things. How does that work? Don't get me started, right? It doesn't, but I'll just let that slide for a second. So compatibilism, God exhaustively determines all things, okay? Pelagianism, salvation by works. Man, by his own effort, follows the example of Jesus Christ and through good works saves himself. He achieves some standard of perfection, and once you achieve that standard, you are saved, whatever, worthy for heaven, however you want to say that. That is a Pelagianism. That's gospel of works, Pelagianism. Most Orthodox Christians are going to reject that view wholesale, but this is called compatibilist Pelagianism. So guess what? Here's what this view entails. You are saved 100% by your own works. 100%. You save yourself. Also, because God exhaustively determines all things. God is in control of every single thing that happens. God determined what works you would do, and he made you do them. Right? That's how compatibilism and determinism sort of work. God determines all things. So you are saved 100% by works and 100% by grace because God determined that you would do those works, right? 100% by works and 100% by grace. And there's no contradiction between those two because it's compatibilist Pelagianism. That is a perfectly coherent view. Interesting, isn't it? So the compatibilism, the determinism, the God determining all things didn't actually lead to this view that was inherently, grace focused. It instead collapses any distinction you can have between grace and works because works just are grace. Our works, what we choose to do is really just God determining it. So works and grace are the same. All right, I'm going to flip the other side. I'm going to go another view, which I'm going to call free will Calvinism. Free will Calvinism. Now that sounds like a contradiction. Libertarian free will Calvinism. Here's how this view works. It has, as its sort of metaphysical backdrop, libertarian free will, meaning free will in the strongest sense. You are the ultimate first cause of your own choices. You're free in the way that God is free. So in the way that God could have chosen to create or not create, nothing outside of himself caused him to choose one way or the other. That's how people are free. People are free in the same way in a limited sense. They have real choices. They are ultimately the first cause, the ground root cause of their own choices. They are ultimately responsible in the strongest sense. Also, Calvinism is true. So how does this work? So one thing people always mess up about free will is that free will doesn't have to be limitless, right? If I believe that I have true libertarian free will, maybe I can choose to, move my hand, not move my hand. I can't choose to be in Singapore right now. I can't freely choose to be on the surface of the moon right now. There are all kinds of limitations on my free will choices. I have a limited set of choices, even though I get to freely choose among them, right? My choices are limited, and they can be limited by external factors. They can be limited by internal, like psychological factors. Maybe I'm, an alcoholic. I'm so deeply alcoholic that I no longer have a free choice. I have to drink because I'm just addicted. There can be internal psychological compulsion. All kinds of things can limit my choices, right? Okay, limited free will, but libertarian free will, meaning it's truly free. Calvinism says what? You don't have free will choice in relation to anything about salvation. You don't get to choose whether you become a Christian, whether you start believing. You don't get to choose whether you continue believing. You don't have a choice in any of those matters. You are just, by God's sovereign decree, you come to believe, you're regenerated all by his doing, and you remain believing because of God. There it is. That's compatible with libertarian free will, because all you have to do is say, libertarian free will is true. You have limited but real free choices, and choices related to salvation just aren't on the table. Those aren't the kinds of choices that you have freedom about. You have a limited set of options, right? And salvation related choices aren't one of the options, right? If you're one of the elects, right, you don't have the freedom to choose not to be saved. If you're one of the reprobate, you're one of the not chosen people, you don't have a choice to choose to follow God because of sin and depravity and all that. It limits you and you're not able to choose God, right? And you may have freedom, real freedom in other areas. You can choose what you eat, you choose where you drive, you choose all that, but you just don't have real free choice in relation to salvation. Libertarian free will, Calvinism. Those are compatible. That's a coherent view. Now, I don't know if anyone holds that view, but it's coherent. So let me just explain what I just did there. So compatibilist Pelagianism and libertarian free will, Calvinism. What I just did is I mixed and matched. I swapped the metaphysical view of free will, this question about how does free will work? How does God's sovereignty work? And I mixed and matched that with views of salvation, soteriology, Calvinism versus Pelagianism on the other side, right? What I want to illustrate here is, and this has been so frustrating, endlessly frustrating to me. Questions about free will, how free will, God's sovereignty, God's knowledge, how all that works are separate. They're separate from questions about how does grace, how does salvation work? How do people become Christians or remain Christians? Those are two separate questions. You can ask questions about free will and God's sovereignty. You can ask that and not be a Christian. A Muslim could ask those questions. A Jew could ask those questions. A general theist could ask those questions. How does God's knowledge, man's will, and God's will, how do those work together? Give me a metaphysical view that explains that. You don't have to be a Christian. These questions about salvation are specifically Christian questions. How does Christian salvation work? Those are different. And you can mix and match a lot of these views. You can mix and match sort of the metaphysical views of free will and the various views about salvation and how salvation works or doesn't work. So many times in these conversations, the two get blended. And I'm going to accuse the Calvinists here. The Calvinists are guilty of this more than anyone else, in my opinion. They seem to think that you need to accept a certain metaphysical view of determinism or compatibilism where God exhaustively determines everything that happens. You need that because, why? Because you're protecting the doctrines of grace and salvation by faith apart from works. You need to have the sovereignty view in order to have this other view here. That's not true. I just illustrated that with our compatibilist Pelagian. You can be a compatibilist and a Pelagian, a gospel of works believer, and believe in God's complete unilateral sovereignty. And in fact, God's unilateral sovereignty erases any distinction you can have between faith and works. They're the same. Grace and works. They're the same because God just determines what you're going to work out. All right. Taking those apart allows us to untangle things and separately consider questions about how does free will work? And then once we deal with that, then we can ask, how does salvation work? Two separate questions. We can deal with them separately. We can untangle them and stop getting our panties in knots about, grace, gospel of works. We can just divorce those questions, deal with them separately, and then once we have our metaphysical view of what is free will, what even is free will, once we've answered that question, then we can ask, how does free will relate to salvation? How does it work or not work in salvation? Yeah, that's my view. So in future videos, I'm going to get into some of these other issues, some of these more sophisticated views. We have, you're going to get Molinism, compatibilism, open theism, these other options that people throw out there to try and solve this view. And I'm going to get to the view that I think just resolves the question, and it's called something like Boethianism or libertarian timelessness is what I'm calling it. Timeless libertarianism. But before I get there, I just wanted to make this very simple point. Questions about salvation are distinct from questions about how free will works. Those are two different questions. We can consider those questions separately, and that is going to ease a lot of the confusion that comes here. All right, that's it. Let me know what you think in the comments.